Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Australian Society of Exploration Geophysicists webinar series hosted by the ASEG ACT branch. I'm Mike Barlow, Geoscience Australia, and today we're very lucky to have Dr. Mark Dransfield giving a presentation on airborne gravity and gravity gradiometry for high-resolution national gravity grid of Australia. But before I go to an introduction of Mark, some housekeeping. The ASEG acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today and the many lands on which we undertake our work. We recognise their continuing connection to these lands, water and culture, and pay our respects to the elders past and present. Thank you to our corporate members, High Size Total Seismic, VelSeis Integrated Seismic Technologies, DUG, GDD, Santos, Transparent Earth Geophysics, Southern Geoscience Consultants, and AGS. Thank you for your corporate contributions. Also, we have a lot of branch sponsors. Unfortunately, there's not an ACT branch sponsor, but nevertheless, we acknowledge and are very grateful for all the state sponsors around Australia. Okay, when it comes to the presentation in about 3 minutes' time, remember that questions are best put through the Q&A text session, please. Type your question in the box, the moderator will see it. I'm the moderator, I will see it, and we'll get to answer those towards the end of the presentation. Just a reminder of the member benefits: free access to exploration geophysics, free copy of preview, which comes out every 2 months, reduced entry to AGC conferences, free entry to regular technical events in your state, access to job advertisements posted on the ASEG's website, access to the annual wine offer, social events in your state, foster a professional network, connect with generous professional network with wide experience, research funding and travel scholarships for students, and of course, free membership for students and half price for retirees and recent graduates. Okay, please keep in touch. Monthly email newsletters, website, Australian Society of Exploration Geophysicists, through Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can connect via all of those series. I believe I just missed one. Upcoming. No, that's it. Okay, so thank you for joining us today. And Mark Dransfield is joining us to talk about the national gravity compilations across Australia. Mark has 40 years experience as a geophysicist, primarily in airborne gravity gradiometry. He was a member of BHP's Falcon team, working on the world's first airborne gravity gradiometer. The success of Falcon was recognised by a CSIRO Research Medal and an ASEG Graham Sands Award. Mark's experience includes instrument development, data processing, development, interpretation, operations, training, and management. He has published a number of peer-reviewed papers and presented at many conferences. Since 2019, Mark has been consulting as a specialist in airborne gravity and gradiometry. So, thank you for the introduction, and I will hand it over to Mark. Thank you, Mark.
All right, let me just, thank you very much, Mike, for that. Let me just get myself organized here. Beautiful. All right. So yes, thanks once again, Mike, and thanks very much to the ASEG for hosting this talk. For me, this is something of an unusual talk in one way. Usually when I get up and give talks, it's kind of, you know, this is the problem, this is how we went about solving it, here's a solution. Today's talk is about something that's, for me, in a much more embryonic stage. So it's kind of like, here's some ideas, here's some thoughts, and here's some challenges, and what can we do? So it's more questions than solutions. All right, let me move on. I think for all of us as geophysicists. Images like the ones I have on the screen at the moment have kind of been the backdrop to our lives. Pretty much every exploration office I've ever been in, one or more of these maps is sitting on the wall. And pretty much every exploration project I've been involved in, one of these maps appears certainly at some early stage in the project. Well, maybe not the EM one in my experience, because that's kind of a bit new. But you all know the idea, right? This is information of not just enormous value, but just fundamental to the way we do geophysics here in Australia. When it comes to looking at the gravity, which is my particular interest, I was very excited a couple of years ago now when the latest National Gravity Grid came out, and to quote the Geoscience Australia record, for the first time in Australia, ground gravity, airborne gravity gradiometry, and satellite gravity observations have been combined to produce a series of national gravity grids. And the picture on the right, which is taken from that record, demonstrates quite clearly the advantage of using all of the gravity data that we have. So in this particular case, there's an area where the ground gravity is quite widely spaced, and there was an airborne gravity survey over the area. Bringing that into the grid has added an enormous amount of resolution and information to the data set. And for me personally, this is particularly exciting because for over 20 years, I've been working in airborne gravity gradiometry. Actually, that's a bit scary now that I think about it. It's over 35 years. Anyway, at the back of my mind has always been this kind of dream of one day having a gravity map over the whole continent that's got the spatial resolution that our airborne magnetics data has. And that really means, you know, very close line spacing, the kind of 200, 400 meter line spacing, and it means airborne gravity gradiometry, but it would make a massive change in the way that people use gravity for exploration and for mapping and for all the other purposes that it gets used for. So very exciting prospect for me. Continuing on the theme of the latest release, if you look at these two maps here, you can see on the top the state of play in effective station sampling before these data were released, and then below it, the state of play afterwards. And it just so happens in the period between those two data releases, in Western Australia, a large number or large area of airborne gravity and airborne gravity gradiometry was flown. And so you can see the amount of red, the 11 kilometre or so space data, has shrunk dramatically. By doing that, you're improving the effective station sampling, and that means you're delivering, as we saw in the previous slide, much better spatial resolution. So if you look at the state of play, what we've got now is some patches of 11 kilometre station spacing, big areas in the kind of range of 4 to 8, that kind of cyan through to, I don't know what that is, pale green to yellow, I suppose, colours. And then lots of equivalent of 2 kilometre, the blues, really the darker blues, not beyond, but not the cyan. So, you know, it's a vast improvement. But as I said before, the national TMI data set is at about 200 to 400 metres. So there's only one more order of magnitude to go. The gravity data gets used by a lot of different people. There are the mineral explorers, most of my background has been in mineral exploration business. There's geodesists. There's people who, probably for one of these other purposes, are inverting data to get density models of the Earth. There are people looking for water. There are people who are doing research. And all of those people have different purposes, different applications, prospective geology, looking for ore bodies, trying to map the shape of the Earth, trying to come up with density models, trying to map geological controls, trying to understand geological architecture, vast array of applications. And that vast array of applications means different requirements on the data. So here's an example, courtesy of Jack McCubbin, looking at the geodetic application. And so on the left, you can see the terrestrial gravity distribution over southeastern Australia. Looks pretty good. And on the right, you can see the estimate of the error in the Australian vertical working surface, effectively the shape of the geoid. And you can see that there is an area, that area in red, white, and orange, that is significantly worse than the rest, and that we're trying to get rid of. But if you look at the image on the right, on the left, sorry, out just below Mildura, right on the very left, there's a patch that's not very well sampled, but the error in the geoid is pretty good. So this is not to do with station spacing, it's to do with data quality. The error in the area where the geoid is less well known is due to the difficulty of getting good gravity data in the mountainous terrain of the Australian Alps. So you can see in this case, it's not around spatial resolution, it's around data accuracy. So there's a challenge here. To answer the needs of that broad user community, we want to try and get the very best out of the data. But we've got data in the air, on the ground, from satellites. We've got data collected by gravimeters and data collected by gravity gradiometers. The data are at different heights, different sampling rates, and different accuracies. And somehow what we would like to do is combine them to get the best accuracy, the best coverage, the best spatial resolution, the best precision over the whole continent. We want, well, I don't know for sure what you want, but I think you ought to want what I want, which is one gravity grid using all of the data merged in a way that meets the requirements of all the users. Well, we've already had it demonstrated to us that this is possible to do. We can merge data sets from different sources and come up with an improved product, a very clearly improved product. And the method that was used here is the conforming method. So I want to talk about that for a few moments. The conforming method is pretty simple. We start off with some detailed gravity data on the left, top left, that little image, and some regional gravity on the right. The regional gravity, we continue to the same height as our detailed airborne gravity gradiometry gravity, and then we high pass the gravity data, the high resolution gravity data gets high passed, the regional data gets low passed, and we add the two together. So it's a very simple approach. We take a little bit of care about our filter. So we want a filter that's got unity gain across the whole spectrum there, so that we don't introduce any spectral artifacts. And we can use a cosine squared filter for that, as shown there on the right of the slide. So this is a pretty straightforward and easy thing to do. And this shows you an example from a survey in West Africa. It's in the rift zone, so it's offshore. And the top left image which is the DNSCO8 gravity data. You can see the rifting, that gravity low in blue, about 30 degrees from north-south, the direction shown by the arrow. And then the top right image shows you the Falcon gravity derived from the gravity gradiometry. And you can see this phenomenal amount of detail due to complex salt diaparism in the area. But you can also see that the broad gravity low seems to have a strike that's running north-south. And essentially, this is because when you take gravity gradiometry data and you integrate it to get gravity, you push the error, the noise in the data up into the longer wavelengths, and you end up with a less accurate long wavelength. Beautiful data at the very short wavelengths, but when you convert it to gravity, you don't do so well at the very long wavelengths. It's okay, we perform the conforming process, join the two together, and you get the bottom image with the best of both worlds. So the conformed gravity is now accurately mapping the gravity from the broad rift zone signal right through to the very shallow salt signal. The simple method gives us a very good result. So it's fast and it's easy. It does introduce some errors. They're pretty small errors, but nevertheless, it does introduce some errors. Every time you grid any data set, there's some error introduced because you're interpolating. Every time you continue a data set, you're introducing some error. The errors here are very small in that example, but nevertheless, upward continuation does introduce errors. And the filtering, particularly low-pass filtering in the Fourier domain, introduces errors via the padding extension that you have to use for the Fourier domain processing. You don't end up with this process with any error estimates. So that's a piece of information you don't have. And if you think about in Australia, the ground gravity data that's available, you always get an error estimate with that data. Furthermore, the Fourier process assumes that the data are on level horizontal surfaces. And so there's additional errors if they're not. In our previous example, it was over the ocean, so no problems there. A lot of Australia is pretty flat, so that's okay. But in the places where it's not, you will get errors as a result of that assumption. There are workarounds you can do to reduce those errors. Those workarounds slow the method. But really the most important limitation is that if there were any short wavelength pieces of information in the regional gravity, you've lost them because you filtered it. You low pass filtered it. So it's not preserving any variations in the sampling of your data. Here's an example from Queensland, the recently flown Kenobi area, but we're looking at the ground gravity stations here. And this is kind of pretty typical of many areas of Australia. If you look at the sampling of the ground gravity, you get relatively even, broadly spaced gravity stations across the area. And then you get patches of more detailed gravity along roads. Just going to have to move this thing if nope, I can't. The data points in green at the bottom center of that map are data points that have more error, but the ones in purple have less error. They're really good data, and we'd like to include them in our final result. But if we're going to low pass this data set at 5, 10, whatever kilometers wavelength, then all that really excellent information is going to be lost. But that's the kind of thing that right now you might end up doing with an airborne gravity gradiometer data set at 1 kilometer line spacing. In that situation, the ground data set, your regional data set, or are they your detailed data set? It's really not obvious. And the truth is that conforming is not designed for this kind of situation. So we also have this kind of big variation in the data quality. Typically, ground gravity might range somewhere from 0.05 milligauss up to 2 milligauss in error. Airborne gravimetry, kind of around about half a milligauss RMS error. Airborne gravity derived from airborne gravity gradiometry, typically around 0.1 milligauss error. How do we allow for the data quality? Again, conforming can't do that. Conforming just goes, at short wavelengths, I'm going to use these data, and at long wavelengths, I'm going to use these data. We're done. So there are some other things we could be doing. There's a variety of options, and I'm going to go through some of these options and explore where we're at, or at least where I'm at with understanding the alternatives. I'm actually going to start with the last one, the simple grid merge. This is a famous method in geophysics for combining more than one data set. You just grid merge the data. It's all good. The thing is that actually you can't do that in this situation because it's ignoring the height differences. Straight away, you know the Bugay slab correction is 0.3 milligauss per meter. If you've got one data set 100 meters higher than the other, it just isn't going to work. So it's going to rule that one out right from the very beginning. This is not a challenge that has a very simple solution. Okay, so let's look at the equivalent source concept. We start off, we've got a set of measurements, airborne survey lines flowing in the air. In this particular example, I've got G&E and GUV data from an airborne gravity gradiometer survey, but it could be gravimeter data from an airborne gravity survey just as easily. And we've got ground gravity stations sampled along the ground. We take all of those data and we do an inversion to come up with a density layer on some surface defined across our project. So in this case, I've drawn it below the DEM, and that's kind of pretty typically where you'd put it. But that source surface is just a surface of varying density that explains all of the gravity signal we see from the ground and from the airborne data. Once we've got that source distribution, we can now use it to do a forward calculation to calculate the gravity or components of the gravity gradient tensor, or even indeed other components of the gravitational vector at some other location. And here I've put them on a surface above the ground, but a little bit below where the airborne survey data were collected. In fact, we could even map, as it says there, we could even map the gravitational potential from those sources. So that's the basic concept of the equivalent source method. It works pretty well, even on very dramatic output surfaces. This is not an example of merging two data sets together, but it is an example of using equivalent source to calculate different components. So starting off with the G&E and GUV data and using that to calculate the gravity on a surface. This is from a survey with over 1 kilometre of relief, and it was flown with a helicopter with about 150 metres clearance, terrain following. So massive changes in altitude. And there on the right, you can see the gravity data calculated on a smoothed version of the survey height. Equivalent source has got some limitations. The first one is that it's slow. If I run that Mount ASEG example on my PC, I'm probably looking at a day's work, roughly, for the computer. Obviously, I'm pretty relaxed during that time. And if you talked about doing large surveys, a very, very long time. But if you've got access to massive parallel computers like the NCI, that would completely change this. And I have to say right now and give credit to the High QGA team that presented on April the 6th, demonstrating that they can invert airborne EM, widely spaced lines, but it's airborne EM with a lot of channels over pretty much the whole continent. So very impressive work, and demonstrated to me that we can do this. You do get good error estimations from the equivalent source because you get the misfit to the model. And it has the capability of preserving information from all the data sets to the constraints of the source model. So you have to be very careful here to design a source model that will preserve the spatial resolution that's inherent in your data. I think the truth is that there aren't generally available source models that do that at the present time, but I do think the path to getting to that point is relatively clear. And you can also take account of the data quality because you can weight the input data according to their quality. So the data that you know is of poorer quality, you just give it a lower weight in the inversion. So this method, it seems to me, has the potential to do a good job for this problem. The next method on my list was least squares collocation. And this is the one that I know by far the least about. It's the method that geodesists use, and they use it to essentially continue measurements from various heights onto one common height. I'm showing there in those pictures some examples from some relatively recent work that was done to combine measurements of gravity. I think it was only just airborne gravity, although I put gravity and gravity gradient in there, in the air and on the ground for a new gravity model for New Zealand. And so they were looking at ground gravity. So the image on the left shows you the station locations of the ground gravity. Airborne gravity, the image in the middle shows you the line paths taken by the aircraft for the airborne gravimetry survey, and marine gravity from the tracks shown on the image on the right. The process is you choose a covariance model that explains in a stochastic sense the variation of the data with position. Generally speaking, what people use is the model published by René Forsberg in 1987 for gravity and gravity gradiometry. And you calculate the outputs by least squares inversion using that equation there, which involves using your measured data S, the spatial covariance between S and the output locations in CSX, and the spatial covariance of S in CSS. Those covariances are calculated using the covariance model. And you can see in that image, the larger image on the top right is the result over New Zealand. And there's also the estimated errors, the propagated errors through the model in the smaller image just below that. Like the equivalent source, and pretty much for the same reason, because it's an inversion, it's pretty slow on a PC. I don't have any knowledge or information about how that goes if you try to parallelize it. It's kind of outside my field of expertise at the moment. It does give you good error estimation, and it does preserve information from all the data sets to the constraints of the covariance model. And it's worth saying that it's not typically used for the higher spatial resolutions that are typically used in geophysical applications, geological mapping, and so forth. Usually geodesists are using it at a broader spatial resolution. And finally, the input data can indeed be weighted according to quality. So late last year, Jack McCubbin and myself did some, I'm going to say work, but it was close to play, just kind of having some fun with comparing the different algorithms. We used some very simple data models and one more realistic model. And the interest here was, how do these different algorithms compare as a function of wavelengths in the data? And what we were doing, in every case, we were just using flat horizontal surfaces. So pretty simple approach from that perspective. We were just using gridded data, and all we were doing was testing upward continuation. But in this particular problem of merging the data, the upward continuation is one of the major steps. So it's very relevant to the problem. As far as we can tell, there aren't any published comparisons. And I guess it looks to me like there is scope for significant advances, both in geodesy and in geophysics, if the geodesists and the geophysicists get together and compare notes in the way that Jack and I have been able to do. I'm not going to show you all of the things we did. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. So this first one is my approach to the problem, which is, let's start off with the simplest model you can think of, and it's a sine function. So this is a sine function in X and Y, and if we start the very top left, that's the original data, sine function in X and Y over some area. And if we move to the top middle function in that plot, it's the same function calculated at a higher altitude. In fact, it's 1/2 of a wavelength higher. The third one, the image on the third image from the left on the top, is what the FFT upward continuation algorithm produced. So you can compare that with the middle one, which is the truth. And you can see there's some difference. In the second row, starting again from the left, we have the relative percent error between those two. The relative percent error over the whole grid as a function of trimming off the edges. So you can see the error is greatest at the edges. So let's throw away one row of cells around the edge. That reduces the error. As we keep trimming off the edges, the error reduces. So it's kind of looking at the question, how pervasive is the edge effect when we use this algorithm? And you can see for the FFT, the error improves, but it improves relatively slowly. The last image in that panel shows you just profiles, cross-section profiles going from left to right at the bottom and halfway through the image. I'm not really going to spend any time talking about that one because it gets too complicated to talk about, and I don't want to, it's not important for what we're interested in. The next panel across, the next set of 6 images, is the equivalent source solution. So once again, we have the original data, the true data at half a wavelength higher, and the equivalent source solution. Then on the bottom 3, the relative percent error, the error, RMS error across the whole image as a function of edge trimming, and the 2 profiles that we're not going to worry about. But just looking at the vertical scale on the error after trimming edges, you can see that the Fourier transform starts at 4 and the equivalent source starts at 1. So the equivalent source is doing significantly better here. It has a lot of its error is in the first cell or 2 around the edge. So pretty minor trimming drops that down to 0.75 error pretty quickly. So that's actually significantly better on this example. Then at the bottom, we've got the least squares collocation, same ordering of the plots. So let's just go straight to the bottom line. The error after trimming the edges starts at 6, decays more quickly than the FFT method. It's kind of similar to the FFT method, not doing as well as the equivalent source. And the reason why is that a sinusoid model is not a great input for a stochastic covariance model prediction. So that larger plot that you can see right on the bottom left shows you, and I hope you can see this, in green, we have the fitted model, and in blue, we have the empirical covariance prediction. And there's a pretty large deviation between the two because the fitted model is just simply not designed for a sinusoidal function. It's not a good model to be testing a least squares collocation on. So let's look at a more realistic example. Let's get some real data. And in this particular case, our real data is pretty broad data, long wavelength information. It's the Earth gravity model from 2008 over a portion of southeastern Australia. So a lot of the signal here is signal from the Australian Alps. We expect the least squares collocation to do very well in this example because this is what it's designed for. It's the same ordering of the plots. So fast Fourier transform on the top left panel, equivalent source on the top right, and least squares on the bottom. And finally, on the bottom very left, the covariance model and its fit. Let's start with that first. You can see that the prediction fits the model pretty well here. The red dots in this case, it's not a great image, but the red dots and the blue dashed line lie pretty much over each other. And without spending time going through all of the images just yet, the error after trimming for the least squares collocation is about 0.1. For the equivalent source, it's about 3/4, 0.75 again. And for the FFT, it's about 0.15. So the equivalent source has done the worst. Fast Fourier transform has done much better. And the least squares collocation has done the best. Interestingly, if you look at the relative percent errors, which is the bottom left panel, bottom left image in each panel, you can see that the relative percent error, the difference between least squares prediction and the truth is pretty much random noise. Whereas in the equivalent source solution and in the least squares solution and in the FFT solution, there's clearly been signal lost in their efforts to reproduce the data. There's a few other interesting things in there, but I don't want to dwell on them because the truth is that a lot of the limitations of what is going on here will prove to be a result of the choice of particular algorithm rather than a choice of the method in general. In other words, I know for a fact that you can do much, much better on the equivalent source in general than the very simple algorithm that was used in this particular case. So all of that is to say that this particular study is incomplete in that sense. It doesn't investigate all of the relevant aspects that are important for merging gravity data sets together. It's limited to particular algorithms in each case. It's just, Jack and I chose the algorithms that we had access to very quickly and easily. So the findings are very preliminary. As I've already said, we did a number of runs. There's more information than I've shown here today. What we found was that all methods perform best if the height changes are small. I don't think that would be a surprise to anybody. The least squares collocation depends on having a good covariance model. Depends very strongly on that. It was best for the long wavelength models, which is not too surprising. That's kind of what it's designed for. The equivalent source did better when the sampling was poor. I didn't show you examples of that, but that was the result. And it generally did best at the shorter wavelengths, and the FFT was the fastest. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm at in trying to understand how you would go about doing this work. There's a lot more things to be done. There's another aspect, which is the height. So if you're going to merge all the data onto a single grid, you need to choose what height you're going to do that at, and then you have to continue the measurements to that height. So what height should you choose? Well, you want to use all of the available gravity information to derive the best estimate of the gravity on a surface above the Earth by about 100 to 300 meters. And that is kind of equivalent to a sample spacing in the range 140 to 420 meters. So this is kind of my gut feeling, and you might suspect, and fair enough, that I might be biased by my desire to get a map that looks as good as the AeroMag map in terms of spatial resolution. That 140 to 420 sample spacing maybe gives that away. But it's also because, if you grid ground gravity data directly from the ground, you introduce some aliasing. If you go up a little bit first, then you minimize the aliasing. You do want a product that's comparable, I think, at the end of the day with AeroMag, and that's a similar height to the height that the AeroMag's flown at. We already know from the investigations we've done so far that you get the best data if the height changes are small. So you're flying surveys at 80 meters, 150 meters, maybe 300 meters above the ground. So you want to be in that range to get the best outcome from your continuation. And finally, I noticed that the 2019 National Gravity Grid Series B is on a draped surface at a minimum height of 250 meters. And so it's not surprising to me at all that the very skilled people who did that work chose that height. And I've reproduced an image of that height from their report just here. So I think basically, yep, that looks to me pretty much the right place to be doing this. Okay, so that's kind of, I guess I'd say as much as I know so far. So my conclusions are that I want, and I think we all should want, one gravity product that preserves the maximum information from all the measurements we have and that has good error estimates. Right now, we have got Conforming, which looks good and does a very good job for a number of purposes, but has some limitations. And I think the truth is that it's actually possible to do better, even though doing better does require a significant amount of work. And really, you know, the first step in doing better is to start off by properly investigating the options. Should we be doing collocation? Should we be doing equivalent source? Maybe we should be looking at a combination. Maybe there are other methods that we should be using. We need to develop tools to do this, and we need to get, I haven't written it down here, but I think we also need to get a gang of people, a bunch of people, a mob of people who are keen, enthusiastic, and want to make this happen. And that's really all I have to say. So I hope that there's some questions, but thank you everybody for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's excellent. And thank you also for promoting the National Geophysical Compilations that GA puts out. All right, that's much appreciated. Yes, indeed, there are questions, and I'm sure there'll be some questions in the audience there too, Mark. And if you answer some of those, can you please repeat the questions so that we can hear online? But look, I'll first go to some of the questions online from Dennis Woods. What is the time difference between the two Australian-wide gravity station density maps that you showed very early on? It looks as though Western Australia is the only area that has seen a major density improvement.
So that's a good question. And somebody else will know the answer to this much better than me, but I have a feeling that the last gravity compilation was 2015 or 2016. But I guess more relevant to the question, Western Australia flew a vast area of airborne gravity and airborne gravity gradiometry surveys through the period 2016 to 2018, I guess, maybe 2019, but I think it was 2016 to 2018. So there's a lot of information.
You're actually spot on, Mark, and I was going to let you answer that. Yeah, so yeah, the last gravity compilation was in 2016. So yes, you're right. Yep. A question from Kim Frankham. How did you compute the ideal upward continued response for the real data set over the Alps?
Can you just say that again?
Yeah, sure. Okay, and yeah, so how did you compute the ideal upward continued response for the real data set over the Alps?
Well, I didn't. I guess Kim is referring to what was done for the 2019 National Gravity Grid, and I honestly don't know the details, but of how that was done. I'm just kind of looking around the room here, but I guess what I would say in the first instance is hopefully that's explained in the GA record for that deliverable. So that would be the first place to look. And if not, the second place to look would be, you know, the list of authors at the front and grabbing one of them. I honestly, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe Kim, if you want to contact us, and we'll try and help you out with that one as well, if you can't find it in the record. And I'm certain that it is actually in the record. Over to Cericia Martinez. Thank you, a great summary. For the examples, what was your strategy or what strategy would you recommend to specify parameters for the equivalent source and the least squares covariance?
That's a very nice question. Yes, well done. Well, so let me answer the least squares collocation one first. I have no expertise here. I would just ring up Jack and say, Jack, what do we do? The little bit of experience, I guess, that I've seen from that was that the process here is that the covariance model is an equation from the 1987 paper by René Forsberg. And what you do is you run your known data through a piece of software that generates parameters to get a fit to that model. So the model's got three, I think, free parameters that you need to work out. Once you've got those three parameters, away you run. It's all, as far as I can tell, kind of pretty much push button technology there. So I guess what I'm saying is that the model helps you to predict the parameters that you need to use in that case. In the case of equivalent source processing, I think that, you need to be, one of the things you need to do is try and balance the smoothness of the model against the accuracy with which you fit the data. So there's a parameterization that you need to sort through there. Then you need to think about how you're going to weight the data. In other words, you've got information from the ground data and from the airborne data about what the errors are in those data sets. And those errors ought to be used to produce weighting coefficients. But there's a piece of work that needs to be done to say, well, what noise level corresponds to what weighting coefficient. There's another parameterization that you need to do, which is where do you place your equivalent source surface? My opinion is that you want a source surface that is not flat, but that is actually undulating and that is close to the ground surface. In my experience on other projects, slightly below the ground surface, but that is potentially up for grabs. You also have to choose what the dimensions are of each individual source within that source surface and what geometric shape it has. And that choice has impacts on the quality of the product, and it has impacts on the computation time. And so you've got to make sensible choices there as well. And I hope the impression that people are getting from all of this is that there's a fair amount of complexity in doing it that way, and that for the particular problem that I'm talking about today, the answers to those questions are yet to be developed. I have some biases based on my experience in other projects, but the fact is that that's work that needs to be done, and it's significant work that needs to be done. It's not huge, though. So I hope that answers the question, Cece, to some extent.
I have another question from Kim, but I'd like to ask you a question too, Mark. When you look at the errors that are introduced through the merging process, whether it's equivalent source, least squares, fast Fourier transform, et cetera, do you think there's also value in better digital signal processing and better instrumentation to improve the data that goes into that merging process? Or do you think the bulk of the value is going to be in improving the merging process?
I guess, to me, that, you know, modern ground gravity data is extremely good. You know, we're sub a tenth of a milligauge for sure with modern ground gravity data. Whereas airborne gravimetry and airborne gravity gradiometry are, you know, roughly speaking, an order of magnitude less accurate. And the limitation for airborne gravimetry is primarily around the wavelengths. So if you're going to longer wavelengths, being a little bit less accurate, it's actually not quite as big a deal for many applications. There are some applications where it is a big deal, but for many it's not. So not so pressing a need, perhaps. For airborne gravity gradiometry, where you're looking at the shorter wavelengths, then lower noise would definitely be an advantage. So I think that's really important to recognise that, and it's a good question on that perspective. But on the flip side, you know, the cost of developing better instrumentation in either sphere is, you know, tens of millions of dollars kind of money, whereas the cost of merging all the data sets is dramatically lower. So, you know, it would be good to do both. But right now, I think you can get, you know, bang for your buck pretty easily, comparatively easily, let's say, through better merging. But I think it's, you know, it's certainly true that developing much better technology would also make a big difference.
Okay, all right, good, thank you. Back to Kim Frankham. Have you or others considered using wavelets for merging data, i.e. wavelet transform both the ground and airborne data, then intelligently merge the wavelets and untransform?
No. Good suggestion. Thank you. That's that one that can go into the other list that appeared on a couple of the slides. No, had not thought about that at all. So I've used software that uses wavelets to increase the speed of the computation as a kind of, in that kind of approach, but I had not thought of, and in fact, I don't really know anything about how you would use wavelets to transform the data or to up and continue the data. Very interesting idea. It'll get added to the list and get looked at. Kim might expect some questions coming back at some point.
All right. Mark, do you have any questions there in the audience?
Nope, they're all good. They're all asleep, let's be honest. I shouldn't have done that. I all clapped at the end of my talk. So I have to acknowledge that. Please withdraw that, ignore that, delete it. This does get edited before it goes to air, doesn't it?
I just have one other question for you, Mark. You know, obviously the Falcon technology was developed 20 years ago, and I believe through military operations that it came about. Who's driving the current technology? Is it the geodists, the resource explorationists, or again, do we need to rely on the military to develop a new system that we can employ?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So Right now in airborne gravity gradiometry, I would say that there are very few people seriously working in the field at any kind of advanced position. There's people very early stage doing fundamental research, which might in the course of time lead to something interesting, but really at the moment, if you wanted to go to somebody and say, we'd like, better technology, I think you're still in the position that Lockheed Martin are the only people you could approach. The question of who drives it, so that's, who can do it, who drives it, who wants it to happen, is a different question. I feel like we're in a situation right now where the driving is done by interested people, interested technical people. So people like me, rather than people like the chief geophysicist of a mining company. I don't see much evidence of, resource companies or other end users coming to service providers or going to Lockheed Martin and saying, we need better instrumentation. That doesn't seem to be happening. I don't know why that is. I hope it's, I think if they had better instrumentation, they would be happy with it.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Mark. We've run out of time. Unless there's a very quick question, I'll have to close it there. Just looking again, no new questions. So thank you again, Mark. And if the audience would acknowledge Mark for a fantastic talk. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, Mike.